Hi, everybody. We're back for episode 3 of what started out as a rant series, but I now think I'm just going to use as an education and advocacy series. Again, I'm doing this all on my own. This isn't sanctioned by any group or any collective at all. I'm not being paid for this. This is my own. This is my own work. So, with that being said, let's dig into it. So, looks like 2 days ago, Governor Doug Ducey made the declaration, we are not going to be releasing any prisoners relative to COVID-19, despite the overwhelming evidence that when COVID hits the prison system, it will be significantly detrimental to the population, to the staff, to the private contract workers that go in there, and then correlatively to the public. It's an absolute incubator for an outbreak. So there's only so much isolation. I've dealt with those issues in my prior videos. If you haven't watched them, please go back and watch them. Comment, positive, negative, either way is fine. I don't mind. If you could, subscribe to the channel and like the channel, because I'm going to have more of these going forward. So my goal here is to try to educate people about what really goes on in the Arizona Department of Corrections. So we're going to take apart Governor Ducey's statement about he's not going to be releasing any prisoners. So the first and foremost thing is the Arizona Department of Corrections releases prisoners 7 days a week. Let's not confuse things. I looked at this number recently, and I'm sorry, I should have looked at it before this video, but it's somewhere between 10 and 19,000 inmates a year are released from the Arizona Department of Corrections. And I'll put that number up. I'll find that number and I'll put it in this video. So go with what I post in the video, those numbers. People get released. This is the thing that people don't latch onto when we talk about these things, which is that 95%, more than 9 out of 10, 95 out of 100 inmates that are in the Arizona Department of Corrections come home. They come home at 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever, but they come home. So the Arizona Department of Corrections is releasing people every single day of the week, 7 days a week. They release people. It's what they do. They take people in, they hold them, they release people. So Governor Ducey's statement is a little bit misleading. He's saying he's not going to release them behind COVID-19, but let's not mistake each other. The people are released every day. Now, the big argument is, how are we releasing these people and what condition will they be in when they're released? In the last video, I attached the I always mess up this word, epidemiologists that was on the Joe Rogan show, has 40 years of studying outbreak. He predicted the outbreak exactly where it took place, where it came from. He had predicted in a book from years before, and he's an expert in this, and he made the argument that you keep with the boats, with the ships out in the sea, the cruise ships, that you get them off the ship as quickly as possible. Containing them on the ship only exacerbates the problem and increases the exposure to everybody else on the ship. So we have 42 cruise ships running around Arizona. There's, I think, 42 yards, plus greater than 40, on 14 different complexes in the state of Arizona. So I made that an argument in my last video. We need to get the people out of the way. The Arizona Department of Corrections has identified 6,600 or greater than 6,600 highly vulnerable inmates that have pre-existing health conditions or are at an age group where COVID is going to be absolutely a death sentence to those people. They've done that work, and Governor Ducey, in his absolute callous disregard for human life, has come out and said, we're not releasing anybody. You went in there for some low-level Class 6 felony, and you just happen to be vulnerable to this disease. I'm going to leave you in the environmental conditions which are going to guarantee your death. You now have received a death sentence. So let's not pull any punches. The Governor Ducey has decided to execute inmates with this policy. When COVID-19 breaks out in the Department of Corrections and those vulnerable inmates are infected, they are going to die. Many of them are going to die. Many of them are going to get so sick, and they're going to put a burden on our hospital systems and all that. So that's the issue. They also came out and said, Governor Ducey said, today I saw Maria Paletta put in the Arizona Republic that Governor Ducey has been advised that we will be dealing with COVID-19 through May. So we have a lot of ground to go. We have a lot of ground to go, and a lot of problems moving forward. So people are released every day from prison. Every single day they're released from prison. So we're in the business of releasing prisoners. 95% of them come home. So today's focus is going to be talking about privates. So when we look at Governor Ducey's motivation for making those type of statements, what's the motivation to murder people, to put people in harm's way for low-level felonies, drug possession, some minor burglary, robbery, something like that? Some not serial killers. We're talking about the huge population, the 95% population of the Arizona Department of Corrections. 70% of them are in there for some low-level drug transaction, or had drug transaction in their thing, drug-related crimes. I mean, these are people that need treatment, right? They're sick. They need treatment. They don't need prison. But irrespective of that, what drives a politician to make just a statement that is so callous to human life as what the governor has done here? So there's the political aspect of it, which I'm going to deal with in a video tomorrow. And today I'm going to talk about the financial thing. So the rule is, when you're investigating, doing investigative journalism, or you're investigating a crime or investigating anything, is just follow the money. If you want to know what the motivation is, the primary motivation is, follow the money. So let's follow the money. Okay? So we're gonna take a look at Arizona's relationship with private prisons. Okay? And why the governor can't just release all the people that can come out right off the bat. What the problem actually is. So to back up and give you just a little synopsis of my history again, I was in the Arizona Department of Corrections for 15 years. I went in 2003, got out in 2005, went right back in 2005 as a recidivist, and released in 2018. I spent a total of a little over 15 years in the Arizona Department of Corrections. While I was in the Arizona Department of Corrections, I was on 13 different units, because when you behave yourself in there, they move you constantly. That's another issue. If you're a good inmate, you get moved constantly because they're always needing to fill bed positions in different places with inmates that behave themselves for work requirements and work assignments and all this kind of stuff, because we have all these contracts, which we're going to discuss here in a second. So when I was in the Arizona Department of Corrections, I ended up spending a significant amount of time in 3 different private prisons. Okay, I personally was sent out to Indiana, which was that was the Newcastle Correctional Facility in Indiana in 2007 and 2008. I was there, and that was run by Geo Corp, which we'll talk about in a second. Geo Group. I then was also subsequently sent in 2008 to the Great Plains Correctional Facility in Oklahoma, in Hinton, Oklahoma, that was run by Cornell Corrections. And then later on in 2013, I was sent to the private prison up in Kingman, which is run now by Geo Group, but was previously run by Management and Training Corporation, MTC. So I've got a lot of experience in the private prisons, and then I was in a bunch of the state prisons as well. before we get started a little bit further, I want to give a little background too about an organization that's been out there for a number of years. That's primarily a Koch brothers funded organization, but has blossomed into quite an organization. It's called ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Committee. And what they do is that they go around, and this is a very conservative, very hard right-wing organization that goes around and proposes model legislation. So it's always business friendly, and because it's a Koch brothers foundation originally, I believe it was just Koch. It might have been some of the other really, really rich billionaires in the world. But ALEC states, or ALEC and then ALEC states, they propose legislation. Some of the jewels that we've had come out of ALEC have been truth in sentencing. Truth in sentencing that happened at the federal level and the state level was a construct of ALEC. We still are living with that here in Arizona. Also, SB 1070 came out of ALEC. And just any number of really hardcore pro-business, anti-regulation, and then the private prison industry is a huge contributor to ALEC. In the state of Arizona, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, the House Judiciary Committee, John Allen, is the chairman, the state chairman for ALEC states. And I will put up some graphics here and some pictures looking at ALEC states about who attended ALEC states. And this is a legislative exchange committee, right? They want to have laws all over the country at the state level to protect their business interests and further their profit margins. So what was remarkable was one of the most recent sessions of ALEC states who went from Arizona. John Allen got a bunch of the members, the Republican members of the House and Republican members of the Senate to go to ALEC states. The governor went to ALEC states. Governor Ducey went to ALEC states committee meetings. Clint Bullock, who's one of our Supreme Court justices and is married to one of the Arizona state legislatures, went to that. Why a Supreme Court justice would ever put himself in that kind of position, I'll never know. Nobody will know. So these people process model legislation, and these people are huge contributors. The companies that support ALEC states are massive contributors to the campaigns of politicians. Now, I'm also going to put up another graphic speaking specifically about the private prison industry. One of the biggest players in politics is Geo Group. They also contribute to PACs, and they also contribute directly to the party. So they contribute to individual members of the legislature, they contribute to their parties, and they contribute through PACs. And I'm going to show some of those graphics because that's actually all reported here in Arizona, which is amazing. You can see where the money is. So let's also take a little bit of a look at exactly who the private prison companies are, the big players. The two biggest players, and I think they go back between number one and number two. It was Corrections Corporation of America, which is now called Core Civic. So Core Civic, formerly CCA, was the world's largest private prison company, and they may still be. And then number two would be Geo Group, which used to formerly be Wackenhut Security, and they're a global security company. Both these companies have ties into some pretty nefarious stuff worldwide, and good stuff. It's not all nefarious, but the private prison industry element of it, in my opinion, is extremely nefarious because it profits off of human enslavement and misery. Irrespective, so your big players are Geo Group and Core Civic, formerly CCA. Some of the other ones are, like I mentioned, Cornell, which is a smaller player, Management and Training Corp, which is a smaller player. Who am I forgetting? Let's see if I have a list here. There's other groups as well, but the main ones that we're going to talk about today are Geo, Core Civic, Management and Training Group, and we might mention Cornell one more time, but the three players that are big players in the state of Arizona are those three. Those are the three big ones. Management and Training Group had Kingman and had Marana. They still have Marana. They lost the Kingman contract after the riot in 2015, the massive riot that happened at the Kingman prison. MTC lost that contract. So when we look at private prisons, we got to go back to the early 2000s. We had overcrowding because of truth in sentencing and because of just an unbelievable, overzealous prosecutors in the three of the biggest counties in the state, Maricopa, Pima, and Yavapai County. We just have the most heinous prosecutors in these counties for the longest time, and they literally locked up everybody. They started charging people with multiple felony offenses for crime and a whole bunch of things that we've talked about before. Started just really using the cudgel of their office, which is the most important office. By the way, the most powerful local elected official is your county attorney. And we're going to talk about that in a different video. Your county attorney. Your county attorney can put everybody in prison, including other officials. They're the most powerful people. They are the ones that control our prison population. They're the ones that charge and send people to prison. So, we've had a swath of just literally heinous county attorneys in the state of Arizona, in many counties, and our prison population expanded beyond our capacity. And so starting in the early 2000s, we started sending male inmates throughout the country. They went to, it was 2004, I think it was, 2003, 2004, they started sending inmates to Texas. There was two facilities, Pecos, and I can't remember what the other one was. Pecos and another one in Texas. They started sending people to one town in Oklahoma, not the one I went to, it was a different one. And then 2007, they opened up in an emergency, which was just a crazy thing. California, actually, the history on this one was California was entering into a contract to house inmates in Indiana, at an Indiana facility, because in Indiana, in this small town, and here's the driver of this, in these small towns, there was a small town, Newcastle, Indiana, that had a Chrysler manufacturing plant there, and the Chrysler manufacturing plant went out of business, and that caused wide-scale, there's the people that work in the plant, and then there's the people that work around the plant in ancillary services in the secondary and tertiary levels, right? So restaurants and all this stuff. So when a big giant employer comes out, it just sucks the life out of a community. And so that vacuum, that nature abhors, that vacuum gets filled by private prison industry, comes in and looks at these places and goes to these places and says, we're going to revive your economy. If you let us put a prison here, a private for-profit prison here, we will hire everybody in the community to come work at the prison, and then your restaurants will survive and all that stuff. So it's a community resuscitation program. That was the way that these private prisons got into all of these small towns and rural locations. And when, the local chambers of commerce, they're like, my God, all of our businesses are dying and people are on unemployment and all kinds of things. This is an attractive option to them. And everybody hates prisoners, so why not? Lock them up. Lock them up. Lock them up. So, in 2007, California was entering a contract with Indiana, with Geo Group to go into that facility that they had filled that vacuum with. And at the very last minute, the very strong California Prison Guard union filed an injunction against the state of California and cited California law that says that they could not send those prisoners out of state. And so at the very last minute, that injunction killed that contract between California and Indiana. And the director at that time, her name was Dora Schriero, and this is under the Napolitano, Democratic Governor Napolitano's tenure. They had a severe overcrowding issue here in Arizona with the male prisons. It was really bad. I was in at the time. and we were stacked and racked. And so they, at the very last minute, Arizona jumped on that contract and immediately started sending inmates out there. And the facility out there was not ready for Indiana. There was Indiana inmates on half of the yard, Arizona inmates on the other half of the yard, and it was, in no uncertain terms, a freaking shit show. So, riots happened. It was a really, a big riot happened. There was problems there. There's massive problems. But, so that's 2007. So we've got 2 in Texas. We've got the one in Oklahoma. Indiana comes up. They open another one in Oklahoma, Hinton, which I ended up going to. And at the same time, they constructed the massive 3,500 man 2-unit facility up in Kingman. So those are the privates. Now we have other private prisons here in Arizona. We actually import, if you don't know this, we import prisoners from Hawaii and Alaska into Arizona and house them in private prisons that are here. So Arizona inmates aren't in them, but those out-of-state inmates are brought here to Arizona and housed in those facilities. But we do have other private prisons here, which I will list out in a second, that are housing Arizona inmates, which is the conversation that we're having here today. So in 2008, everybody knows we had the Great Recession, and Arizona was decimated by the Great Recession. We had a massive problem in Arizona because we had a legislature that just absolutely, I think there are 20, I would rely on Howard Fisher for this one, but there are like 27, 28, 29 years, something like that, of cutting taxes in the Arizona legislature. Doug Ducey has promised when he came in he would not raise one dime in taxes, and he meant it. And so, I wish that they would actually call it what it is, which is that they're not going to fund state services, right? So they're going to go by the tax money. I mean, the taxes pay for state services. They pay for other shit too, and I understand people get all up in arms about that. I'm not going down that road, but at the bare minimum, they do pay for state services. So like your police, your fire, your roads, the Department of Education, the Department of Corrections. I mean, those people all make money, and they, in all the different, the game and fish, and all of the different DEQ, all the different departments, they make money. They have employees. They have to pay for their services. That comes from your tax money. So when we say we're not going to, the taxes pay for government services. So really what they were saying was, for 27 years, we're going to cut the funding for government services. That's a Republican mantra. They want to starve the beast. They don't like government. They're supposed to be not liking the federal government and starving that beast, but they really starve all government. Anti-regulation. That's whatever. That's your political paradigm. That's your pickle to tickle. All right. So what happened is that we had a massive problem in 2010. The state actually leased the state capitol to raise funding. We had such a gap in funding in our budget that they actually sold our state capitol with a lease back, which was just insane. I mean, think about that. The state of Arizona sold our capital and then leased it back from the people that bought it with a buyback option. Just unbelievable. Anything to not raise taxes. So, then what they looked at and what they actually did, and I'm talking about the GOP legislature with now GOP Governor Jan Brewer, what they actually attempted to do was sell the entire Arizona prison system, all the complexes, all the inmates. They tried to sell that to the private prison industry. And the private prison industry, this would have been a massive, massive boon for the private prison industry, who are all real good and bud chummy with donations to our legislators. I wonder why that became a solution. Could it be Alex States and those donations? All right. So they tried to sell the entire prison system to the private prison industry. The private prison industry actually came back and said, we can't help you. We can't take the entire system. We can take all lower level custody, like the minimum level custody and the medium. The prison's divided up into 4 levels. It used to be 5. one being the most nonviolent, whatever. The best inmates were 1s. The most high security were 5. Now it's a 4-tier system, so it's minimum, medium, close, and maximum custody. So they're like, we could take your minimums and mediums, but we will not take your close and your maximums. We can't do it. We can't take that liability. Our insurance people won't do it. So the Arizona legislature tried to sell our entire prison system off to the private prison industry, and they had to say no, couldn't take it. That went back and forth. They did privatize the entire prison healthcare system at that time. That's when we went to privatized healthcare, and that's been a debacle of biblical proportions. So that's what's happened. That's what happened in that. At the same time that we were having that, right about the same time, our legislature and our governor, Jan Brewer, who never met anybody with melatonin in their skin that she liked, they created, and this is an Alex States creation, by the way, came down with Senate Bill 1070. And who was in the room in negotiations on that? And this is public record. You can look this up. The private prison industry. So you had legislators, you had the governor's office, and you had the private prison industry representatives all in a room, and they negotiated out Senate Bill 1070. And why? Why would we care about why would the private prison industry be in the room when we create a bill like HB 1070? Well, because all of those people that have brown skin, whether they're American or from a different country, that got arrested were going to be detained and held and imprisoned in those new private private prisons. So, you think that they're not driving legislation? So they work through Alex States to create this legislation. They're in the room with their crony capitalist puppets that they have funded, that have gotten in the legislature and control the legislature. And they control the narrative, and they control the story, and they control the direction of legislation. And so these people were in the room when 1070 was being passed. That was the biggest crony capitalist government corporate welfare subsidizing legislation at the state level I think that has ever happened. It was remarkable how bad that legislation was. And of course it all got struck down by the United States Supreme Court except one element of it. Through 75% of it got struck down. They still claimed a victory. So that's what was going on. So we had the attempt to sell the entire prison system to the privates, and at the same time we had SB 1070. All of this was going on during the Great Recession. I'm not going to raise taxes though. Okay. So one of my places where I was a GP unit called Meadows at Eyman Complex. I was there in 2009 through 2011. So I was there during the heart of this situation that was going on. I was in prison during the entire pre, during, and post Great Recession period. And so at Meadows Unit, I actually worked for a CO4. In the Department of Corrections, you have the guards, the line level guards that come and do count and you interact with on a daily basis, the ones that wear uniforms. Those are CO2s. And then after CO2, when you promote, you can either go up the security side and become a sergeant, then a lieutenant, then a captain, then a major, and then maybe up into the administrative side. Well, captain and above is administrative. Or you can go up programs. So it bifurcates into security and programs. On the program side, the first level is called a CO3. And the CO3 is like your case manager in prison. So when an inmate has an issue and he has to go talk about his release, or he has to talk about programming, or he has to talk about all that stuff, that's a CO3 level. CO3s do all of that stuff. They're the line level administrative workers. They're not administration, but they're the administrative workers. Where the CO2s and sergeants and lieutenants are the security side. They all start out as CO2s, though. They all start out as guards. So above that is a CO4, and then above a CO4 is a deputy warden. So I was a clerk for the CO4 at Meadows Unit, and so they were in the heat of all of this stuff. They had to evaluate and process inmates to go to different units because Meadows had been a sex offender unit. They took all the sex offenders out of Meadows Unit, put us GP people there, GP inmates, general population inmates there, and then they were removing all the general population inmates and going to put the sex offenders back at Meadows Unit. And so at that time, there was a massive rush. There was 1,000 or 1,200 people on this unit. I can't remember what the count was. It was something like that. On this unit, and they had to evaluate everybody to go off either to another state prison or to one of the privates. And there was a number of private prisons that were being considered in-state and out-of-state at the time that were being evaluated. So part of my duties was to help the CO3s evaluate inmates and get all of the documents and everything so that they could evaluate the CO3 inmates. So I was actually in the room when the decisions were being made. And so how that works is how an inmate gets to being in a private prison is that there's metrics. So the private prison, and each one of them had similar but maybe a little bit disparate metrics. The metrics would say, okay, is this person a minimum or medium level custody inmate? Yes, checkbox. Some of them said they can't have these type of pre-existing medical conditions. Other ones weren't concerned about it because they had medical facilities at their unit. But so that was a metric they looked at. Are they medically able to be at this unit? Are they mental health evaluated to be at this unit? So they would look at the period of time. Then they would look at certain things like, has this person ever escaped from prison? Has this person ever assaulted a staff member? Those were the metrics. So if you were a lower level custody, a minimum or a medium, you may have had some medical conditions, but ones that weren't so serious you needed constant trips to the hospital or constant treatment. That you never assaulted an officer and you never escaped from any place, then you qualified to go to those private prisons. And so that's how they would make those assessments. And then they would evaluate everybody into these pools, and then they would submit that to the central office in Phoenix, and central office would then send people based on those evaluations to the various private prisons, and the ones that didn't qualify were sent to other state prisons. Okay, so let's step back on private prisons for a second. Here's the one thing about private prisons. The state enters into contracts that are 20 years in duration. 20 years in duration. So the prison, what happens is, remember when I talked about the community resuscitation programs? What happens is that these companies, they have funding from Wall Street. They're public companies, Geo, Civic, they're public companies, meaning they trade stocks on the stock exchange. They can get massive funding from private hedge funds. There was a couple private hedge funds that were really active in the private prison industry. So they get funding from the private hedge funds. They will go into an area like Kingman, like Golden Valley, Arizona, which is just outside Kingman, and they will build the prison on state land. So the state will say, okay, here's a plot of state land. We will let you use this to make your building project. And what Geo or what MTC or Core Civic does is that they get the funding to actually construct the prison. So the building, the concrete, the floors, the rebar, all that stuff is actually paid for by the private prison. And then what they do is they enter into a management contract for 20 years. And so at the same time, what the state does is the state pays these people these companies on a annual, semi-annual, monthly basis, whatever the payment schedule is. They pay them for the building and to manage the inmates. And so now that company is being compensated not only to manage inmates, but for the building. And then after 20 years, the state owns the building. So it's a program that on its face looks like a pretty decent program for the state. except when you actually get down into the details. This is why being superficial and just looking at headlines is not the end of it. You got to get down into it. It's the management side of it all. So when the state of Arizona enters into those contracts, they enter into those contracts for 20 years, and they have a mandate that they keep those beds occupied at 95%. 95% occupancy rate. Some of the other ones might be a little bit less, but I know the Kingman one was 95% occupancy. So the state of Arizona is required to keep those beds 95% full, or they're in default of the contract and there's penalties assessed. Okay, so that means that the state of Arizona has to be in for 20 years, has to be in a constant cycle of getting inmates that meet those qualifications that I talked about and get them transferred over to the private prison. Okay, so now we start to see the problem. It's a cattle herd, right? They need to get... So every week, and everybody that's been in the Arizona Department of Corrections at a male facility, a minimum or medium facility, knows this. The bus shows up every 6 weeks. Every 6 weeks, you could set your clock by it because the yard goes nuts because no one knows when they're going to get transferred. The bus shows up at the gate. And then 60 or 80 inmates are put on the bus and they're shipped up to Kingman. And it's horrible. And it's horrible up there because the private prisons are freaking horrible. Some worse than others. Wallapai unit, they renamed it Wallapai, the minimum or the medium level custody. It's now housing sex offenders up there, 1,500 sex offenders. That was a horrible place. My God, it's horrible. Surbat was a little bit better. It was warehoused, 200 men in a room, but at least they had air conditioning up there, that was the benefit to there. But you're in a room with 200 people, which is awesome. So 95% occupancy rate. So there's 3,500 beds up there that have to be kept at 95% occupancy rate, and we have other ones. So let me put my glasses on here for a moment. So the other private prisons that we have in use presently are Arizona State Prison Kingman, which is operated by Geo Group, Arizona State Prison Florence West, which is also operated by Geo Group. That's a DUI facility, Florence West. It's DUI and return to custody there. So people that are parole violators come back there, and DUIs are housed there. Arizona State Prison Phoenix West, which is also, you guessed it, Geo Group. That's all DUIs there. The Marana Community Correctional Treatment Facility in Marana, Arizona by Tucson, that is now continuously operated by Management and Training Corporation, which is out of Utah, a Utah private corporation. Then we have Central Arizona Correctional Facility, which is a private sex offender unit that is operated by Geo Group, your best and favorite one. Then you have Red Rock Correctional Center, which is operated by Civic, which is down by Ajo, I think, in that area. So all of these private prisons and all these facilities have a mandatory occupancy rate. Okay, so we talked about the metrics. So now, when we're looking at release bills, or we're looking at kicking out of people out of prison because they're not a threat to society and all that stuff, or when we're looking at a pandemic like COVID-19, and we can reduce the prison population without having an adverse effect on public safety, it makes perfect sense, right? Because the Department of Corrections has to care for these inmates. And so now everybody, and go back to my last video, everybody's housed together, they're housed on top of each other. There's overcrowding still in the Arizona Department of Corrections. There's actually overcrowding on the female unit, so they're sending them to an old, dilapidated, condemned hotel down in Douglas to house them. They're now housing them at Hickman Farms Chicken Ranch. So you got prisoners at a private company. Wow, that's convenient. Wonder if they donate. Wonder if they're sitting on the board of supervisors for the county. All right. So now you got these prisons. So the state pays these companies to house these prisoners. Okay. So the very prisoners that it makes the most sense to release out of prison are the ones that they need to fill those private prison contract beds. So there's the rub. There's the money. Ding, 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 ding. Now you see why our governor can't release these people. First of all, he's the most pro-business governor that we've had. He's Ice Cream Boy, right? He's Cold Stone Creamery. He came in writing on the Chamber of Commerce. He is a wet dream to the Chamber of Commerce. He stacked the Arizona Supreme Court to put more business-oriented minded people. He stacked the court. He expanded the court when they didn't need to expand by 2 other justices, just to make sure that this is all right out of the ALEC playbook. This is all right out of the Koch brothers ALEC playbook. Get the Supreme Court of the state to be pro-business. Get the governor and the legislature to be pro-business, and then we can go in there and we can rape and pillage with no compunction whatsoever, and pollute and do whatever we want. And part of that is this, right? So let's look at the tentacles of the private prison industry. I'll check this metric again, but Mark Brnovich, our Arizona Attorney General, from what I remember, he was a vice president for Corrections Corporation of America, Civic. So they've got people all up in it. I think that Jan Brewer's chief of staff used to work for Corrections Corporation of America. Wonder how they got in the room for SB 1070. They're all up in the government. They're all up in our state government. So in New York and Washington, right, everybody gets angry because politicians and lobbyists in that relationship. And so what happens is that these lobbyists work for these companies, and then they get appointed to be the oversight for the companies. They get appointed to the regulators' offices to oversight the very company that they just were working for, and then they don't do any oversight whatsoever of the company. The company goes and has all kinds of horrible violations and runs us right off to the edge of the world. And then those very regulators, when they're done with their term and the new president comes in, goes right back to work for the same companies that they were just supposedly regulating, right? That relationship. The same thing in New York, right? Why is everybody that has anything to do in our government, over all presidents, including Obama, including Bush, including Trump, including all of them, why every time that we get a secretary of Treasury or a secretary or any of those government positions relative to finance, why are they coming out of Goldman Sachs, right? That's a legitimate concern. They come from Goldman Sachs, they go to work in the government, they regulate Goldman Sachs and the other financial sector, and then they go right back to work in Goldman Sachs. In Arizona, the manifestation of that problem is private prisons, private prison industry. Arizona's big in private prisons. So what happens? Private prison industry lobbyists lobby through ALEC states and all of the other different vehicles and direct donations and party donations and PACs, right? They're in there, they're lobbying these legislators, they're lobbying the governor constantly, they're the chiefs of staff, they're the attorney general, they're in the rooms, and then once they get done with their government service and make sure that the private prison industry is getting fed well, they go back to work for the private prison industry or somewhere else. Terry Stewart, Chuck Ryan, the 2 directors previous to Chuck Ryan had 2 terms. Terry Stewart was right before Chuck Ryan. Both of them went to go work for the private prison industry over in Abu Ghraib. They were responsible for Abu Ghraib and the horrific activities that were going on there. So there is this nexus between the private prison industry and our government. So when we look at the things like what Ducey is doing and saying we will not release a single individual prisoner, well, that's a lie because we're releasing 17,000 a year. But the reason that he would make that cold, calculating thing to put all of those people in harm's way and not depopulate the Arizona prison system with people that can come out and have no adverse to public safety, decrease the budget of the Arizona Department of Corrections and allow for the containment of COVID-19, just absolutely the most intelligent things that you could do. They look at the most intelligent things that you could do, the most effective things that you could do, and they just do the goddamn opposite of it. Why? Follow the money. It goes right to the private prison industry. So, when it breaks out in the Arizona Department of Corrections and it decimates that population, and the state of Arizona is on the hook for all the health care and the adverse effect that happens correlative in all these rural counties and the hospitals, and there's body bags coming out of the state of Arizona prison system that were avoidable, you can look directly right at Governor Doug Ducey, who is going to be running for some higher office. So let's all remember this. Let's all remember this when little ice cream boy starts to run and it starts to run for president, or he starts to run for some cabinet position for the next Republican president, or whatever he's going off to. He's clearly got political ambitions. Let's just all remember this, that when the emergency was here and the time came, the thing that he sided with was his own pecuniary interests, his own financial interests, and he protected the corporations over the people.